From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to the Sculptors Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome to the Sculptors Funeral, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. I'm your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor living and working in the amazing city of Florence, Italy. This podcast is all about figurative sculpture and figurative sculptors, student and professional, past and present. And today, we turn our attention to a sculptor who many regard to be the greatest sculptor of the Romantic era. Now, time and again in art history, we find the various periods of art history have a single standout artist who encapsulates that period, sort of represents it in a certain way. So when we think of the Italian Renaissance, we think of Michelangelo. When we think of the Baroque, we think of Bernini. When we think of neoclassicism, we think of Canova. What name comes to mind when we think of Romanticism? Well, if you've been listening to the last few podcasts, you might say Francois Rude. Although Rude seems to have initiated Romanticism in sculpture, his name isn't synonymous with Romanticism as we might expect it to be. If I had to come up with reasons why, I might point out the fact that official recognition for Rude was limited in his lifetime, and that while Rude heralded Romanticism, much of his later work was infused with strains of neoclassicism. So it's harder to see his work as something wholly new and different. But there is one other factor, in my opinion, that separates the likes of Michelangelo, Bernini, and Canova from Francois Rude, and that is ambition. All four of these artists had exceptional skills and developed sculpture in new ways, but only the first three sought out greatness, had the will and the desire for recognition, fame, glory, whatever you want to call it. Michelangelo, Bernini, Canova, they were bursting with ambition. Francois Rude was not. It's impossible to know how Rude would have conducted his life in order to pursue strong ambition. Would he have maybe played ball with the Academy and the École des Beaux-Arts in order to win official favor and thus success? Perhaps. Would he have refused to show in the Paris Salon for over a decade, as he did, in protest over the way Romantic sculptors were being systematically excluded from the Salon? Maybe he wouldn't have done that. Maybe he wouldn't have sacrificed his own chances for success to make a point like that. Ambition is a tricky thing. Someone who pursues his ambition intelligently will know when to compromise, which battles to pick, and when to stand on principle and when to capitulate. Francois Rude had no such ambitions, and whenever in his career he met with opposition to what he was doing, he just shrugged his shoulders and kept to his principles. Rude did not compromise or capitulate, and throughout his life, he paid a price for that. As it happens, the sculptor whose name is most closely associated with the Romantic movement was a pupil of Francois Rude, a young man with a work ethic and natural skill, like Rude himself, but crucially, this sculptor, a man by the name of Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux, had an enormous amount of ambition, and he pursued his ambition ardently and intelligently. His path to success can be charted by which battles he knew to fight and when he knew to play ball with the powers that be, losing a battle or two in order to win the war. Born in 1827, Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux was the working-class son of a mason living in the city of Valenciennes, France. At the age of 11, Jean-Baptiste and his family moved to Paris, where his father gets a job working for the railroad. Evidently, little Jean-Baptiste had shown some artistic aptitude, as his father enrolled Jean-Baptiste into the École Royale Gratuite du Design, or the Royal Free School of Design. This school commonly went by another name, the Petite École, or the Little School. We can think of the Petite École as sort of the kid brother to the École des Beaux-Arts. The Petite École got its start in the 1760s, and rather than training students in the fine arts as the École des Beaux-Arts did, the Petite École was designed to train workers and tradesmen in elements and principles of artistic design. The goal was to elevate the general quality of manufactured goods of all sorts. The Petite École had been very successful in reaching its general aims, and French goods enjoyed a fine reputation all over Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. And everything from French silverware to ceramics and dishes to candlesticks, jewelry, and other furnishings, commanded a good price on the international market. It's exactly the sort of school a working-class family like Carpeaux's would want to send their son, as after graduation, Carpeaux could be expected to get a job as a skilled craftsman rather than as a mere laborer. Carpeaux studied drawing, architecture, stone-cutting, and geometry, among other things, at the Petite École for 6 years, from the ages of 11 to 17. So after 6 years of studying like this, at the age of 17, Carpeaux could be expected to take up with any of a number of tradesmen or manufacturing firms as a valuable employee. However, during his study at the Petite École, several factors and events seemed to conspire to push Carpeaux in a different direction. When he was 13 or 14, Carpeaux started learning how to model in clay at the atelier of Louis Auvray, a minor sculptor who was from the same town as Carpeaux, Valenciennes. Another native of Valenciennes and businessman named Victor Lié, also living in Paris, takes Carpeaux and several other talented youth under his wing and assists in their general education. Among other things, Lié, seeing Carpeaux's talents as a clay modeler, gives Carpeaux a book to read that he thinks the 14-year-old Carpeaux might find interesting. That book is Toussaint Bernard Émeric David's book. It's called Recherche sur l'art statuaire, or Research into the Statuary Arts. Now, this book may sound familiar to those who listen to my podcast about François Rude. It's the same book in which François Rude found inspiration during his 12-year exile in Brussels. The book which likely set Rude on his path towards developing a new sculptural technique, and it's the book that Rude himself told his students should be the first book in any sculptor's library. It was published in 1805, and the book is practically unknown today, but it was a popular and stimulating book for sculptors in the early decades of the 19th century. And so I guess it shouldn't be too surprising that the young Carpeaux found his way to it sooner or later. But Carpeaux's patron, the one who gave him that book, Victor Lié, was the cause of another connection between Carpeaux and François Rude at this time. Victor Lié enrolled Carpeaux and several other youth from Valenciennes into classes taught by Joseph Jacoto. Now, Joseph Jacoto was a school teacher, but also a philosopher of education, and he had recently gained notoriety as the author of a book on a method of education which he devised, and the book is called The Universal Education. In this book, Jacoto instructs on the principles of what he called intellectual emancipation. In a nutshell, it was a system of principles of self-instruction. Jacoto thought that anything a person wanted to learn could be taught by that person himself to himself, if he goes about it in the right way. Both the book and the method proved popular and successful enough to have spawned a periodical called the Journal of Universal Emancipation, and even influenced various and official school curricula in parts of France and in Belgium. Now, comparing the ideas of Jacoto's method to François Rude's solitary development of a new modeling technique while in exile, we can see that the two have much in common. One might suspect that Rude was employing Jacoto's method when he came up with his new mathematical and optical approach to sculpture. In fact, that was a common assumption during Rude's own lifetime. People thought that Rude was a follower of Jacoto. But Rude himself pointed out that while he shared sympathies, definitely, and principles with Jacoto, Jacoto's book wasn't published until 1823, while Rude had been developing his new technique in sculpture from around 1820, when he opened his atelier in Brussels and began exploring his own method of self-education. But similar approaches to self-education and self-discovery were far from the only connection between Joseph Jacoto and François Rude. Both Jacoto and Rude were from the city of Dijon, and both had moved to Paris. Both were supporters of Napoleon, and both went into exile at Brussels during the Bourbon Restoration. So of course these men knew each other. And in fact, it's just as likely that Rude's method influenced Jacoto's rather than the other way around. We just don't know, really. Both men moved back to Paris from Brussels. Rude moved back to Paris in 1827 and Jacoto in 1830. Rude had his Paris studio at number 74 Rue d'Enfer, And Jacoto's own studio was number 55, Rue d'Enfer, on the same street. They were neighbors in Paris until Jacoto's death in 1840. So it's hardly a stretch to imagine the 14-year-old adolescent Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux at the studio Jacoto, lingering at the door of Rude's studio, trying to catch a glimpse inside at the master's work. And so it comes to no surprise, knowing this, that in May 1844, right around his 17th birthday, Carpeaux joins the atelier of Francois Rude. And in October of the same year, he is awarded a place in the admissions examination of the École des Beaux-Arts. There were 30 available seats, and Carpeaux's entrance ranking was number 24. Carpeaux would work and learn from Francois Rude for most of the next 6 years. There was a period of about a year when Carpeaux had to drop out of Rude's atelier because he couldn't afford the dues that every student had to pay, from late 1844 to September 1845. During this time, he had to work part-time in a porcelain factory in order to pay the rent. He was probably also helping to support his family, too. But for the most part, Carpeaux flourished, both at the Atelier Rude and at the École des Beaux-Arts. Now, it bears repeating that these were two distinct programs of study. Carpeaux was augmenting his education at the École by studying at the Atelier Rude, an atelier which was independent from the École in every way, and was one of what was called an atelier libre, or free atelier. It wasn't until the school reforms of 1863, which I referred to in the last episode, that ateliers would actually and officially be part of the École des Beaux-Arts. So even when Carpeaux had to drop out of Rude's atelier, he was still a student of the École des Beaux-Arts. Now, although Carpeaux shared an affinity and deep understanding of Francois Rude's ideas about art, as well as the ideas of the educational and artistic philosophies of Émeric David and Jacoto, Carpeaux was a very, very different character than Francois Rude. Rude was a gentle family man with great talent but little ambition, who stood out as an exemplar of morality and principle for his students. Carpeaux was gruff and coarse, a little arrogant, a little swaggering, but with his eye to the future and with the will to do what it takes to get where he thought he deserved to be. And if he had to break a few rules to get what he wanted, so be it. 2 years into his training at the École des Beaux-Arts, Carpeaux is caught cheating during a figure modeling competition. Contestants for this competition were forbidden to use resources of any kind, and Carpeaux had smuggled some tracings into his competition cubicle to use as references, and he was caught. But just listen to Carpeaux's attitude about the whole affair as he records the incident in a letter to a friend. As for me, it's not going so well. I was in the May contest. As luck would have it, I was surprised by a guard while at work with some tracings. He filed his report, and the decision was taken to eliminate me. I was really annoyed. How interesting that Carpeaux chalks his elimination up to bad luck rather than to his having cheated. It's difficult to say whether this passage reflects a culture of widespread cheating in the École, or just Carpeaux's lack of guilt and nonchalance with doing what he felt was needed in order to win. A superb example of Carpeaux's pragmatism comes from an extraordinary letter he wrote to a friend in 1850. After 6 years of study at the Petite École, followed by 6 years at the École des Beaux-Arts, Carpeaux had received many awards and honors for his work in competitions and exams at the school, but the coveted Prix de Rome had thus far eluded him. As a student of the École, he had competed 3 times for the Grand Prix, but never made it past the second round of eliminations. Finally, in 1850, Carpeaux made a decision. He explains himself in full in his letter to his friend. You must understand that I left Monsieur Rude with the greatest regret. It was from him that I learned the first elements of sculpture. But my interests were compromised there for a very simple reason, and I'll explain to you why. I think I've done the right thing, but back to the point. Monsieur Rude has a method. I must have spoken to you about it in my digressions about art, which adds up to a way of making sculpture entirely different from that of the École. For example, he claims that sculpture, and to my mind he's right, cannot be done competently except by mathematical rules, That is, by making use of compass, ruler, plumb line, etc. In the end, he makes his students craftsmen, while at the école, everything is done with the aid of the eye alone. And the Institute happily asserts that the arts in general exist more in sentiments than in measurements, which make us cold copyists, grasping only at the material aspect of what we do, while they... Well, I think they're very pretentious in what they say. But I must listen to them. Say and do as they do. And because there is a great difference between these two methods, and because you cannot serve two masters at the same time, I say to myself, let's make a choice. The école being a question of my future, my existence for me, I'm going to use every possible means to attain my goal, and to arrive at this goal, I must change professors. It's a decided, rational action, as you'll see, but I haven't succeeded quite as much as I had hoped. I'll tell you the outcome further on. After much reflection, I didn't hesitate. I found old Abel de Pujol and told him what I've just explained to you. I begged and insisted that he speak to Monsieur Duret of the Institute to receive me as his student. When he promised, it was a ray of hope. And to finish the job, I found Lemaire, whom I as much as forced to support my request, along with Monsieur Abel. These gentlemen met last Saturday at the Institute, where it was agreed with Monsieur Duret that he would give me the advice and lessons necessary to get me into the final competition. Since he wanted to see me, I went yesterday. He received me very well, and even assured me that if I wanted to follow his opinion and advice, I would have the Grand Prix in 2 years. He would take over my artistic education, he told me, by making me study the style of the best Greek period, and setting me to learn anatomy from the bottom up, which for him is the alphabet of plastic art. Now, Louis, I can breathe again. Unfortunately, this gentleman cannot put me to work beside him because he has no studio for students, but in the end, I'm satisfied with this positive outcome. As a result, I'm giving up Monsieur Rude's studio, and I will work at home alone and in museums, and each of my studies will be submitted to these gentlemen, whom I'll see frequently. Such a great letter. I think it's my favorite letter written by a sculptor, and it tells us so much. Carpeaux lays out exactly why he feels he hasn't won the Prix de Rome, what is lacking, what is required and expected of him if he is to win, who's going to teach him what he needs, and even what the lessons will contain. In order for Carpeaux to win the Prix de Rome, he says, he must play ball in the academic fashion. He must learn the Greek style. He must learn anatomy. He must put away the analytical method as taught by Rude and take up academic methods. But most of all, he must sever his association with Francois Rude and identify himself with the patronage of a full academician like Francisque Duret. Eventually, it took Carpeaux 4 years and not 2 to win the Prix de Rome, and he did so with an academically classical, perfectly muscled figure of Hector with his son Astyanax. After 16 years of arts education, and at the age of 27, Carpeaux had fulfilled the first of his professional ambitions. We'll hear all about where his ambition takes him next when the Sculptor's Funeral continues. Many sculptors and sculpture fans listening will be familiar with the works I'm discussing today, but many will not. If you are not, just go to the website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, and in the episode gallery of this podcast, you'll find many images that are relevant to today's discussion. While you're at thesculptorsfuneral.com, you can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. You can listen to every episode of The Sculptor's Funeral for free, and you can leave a comment or ask a question. So, after a rich and varied schooling, Carpeaux wins the Prix de Rome. But we have to remember what the Prix de Rome actually means. It's not recognition of achievement at the end of an artist's education. Rather, the Prix de Rome is recognition of an artist's capability to continue his education. Winning the Prix de Rome was like getting accepted to graduate school after your undergraduate studies. The Prix de Rome winner became a student of the Academy of France in Rome, housed in the Villa Medici, where one was expected to complete various assigned studies and projects, though structured in a more independent program. For Carpeaux, this meant 5 more years of study. I imagine that once the pure joy Carpeaux must have felt after winning the Grand Prix wore off, he was somewhat daunted by the prospect of 5 more years of school, even if it were to be done in the Eternal City. Instead of journeying down to Rome in the autumn of 1854, Carpeaux stays in Paris. In addition to possible study fatigue, Carpeaux has started taking commissions while still a student, and Carpeaux always had his eye towards commercial success at least as much as artistic success. And perhaps Carpeaux wanted to rest on his laurels a bit. After all, he was now first of his peers in Paris, but when he was to arrive in Rome, he would once again be a first-year student. For whatever the reason, Carpeaux delayed his trip to Rome for an entire year. We really don't know why exactly, and it seems neither did the Academy of France in Rome. This delay got Carpeaux into a bit of trouble, and it gave him a bit of a bad reputation at the Academy of France even before he got there. The École and the Academy fully expected any winner of the Prix de Rome to be champing at the bit for their trip, but here was Carpeaux taking his own sweet time. This was unprecedented. But eventually, a year late, Carpeaux finds his way to Rome, where he continues to annoy the Academy of France, but this time in person. The director of the Academy of France, Victor Schnetz, records his first impression of Carpeaux in a letter. Monsieur Carpeaux has finally arrived in Rome, along with 4 other pensionnaires. The new boarders seem to me well disposed to work, and from the little chats I've had with each of them, I have a good opinion of their intelligence. The most uncouth, as you've told me, is Monsieur Carpeaux, but I think he too will shape up in the end. Well, Carpeaux, for his part, did not shape up in the end. From the beginning, he was a problem for both the Academy and fellow students. He made few friends, he was often solitary, often absent from the Academy, off doing his own thing. He was swaggering and boastful, telling his fellow students that he could only find inspiration at the bottom of a wine bottle. Carpeaux was also a bad influence on the students, the Academy thought, due to his interest in commercial success, when the Academy of France was designed to be a sanctuary for gifted students, protecting them from the worldly temptations of money while they improve and elevate their minds in the rarefied air of Rome. Carpeaux was seen as coarse, worldly, and uncouth. Now, when I say that the Academy of France at the Villa Medici in Rome was designed to be a sanctuary for students, it's no exaggeration. Everything was taken care of. The students had chambermaids, cooks, porters. They had a staff of marble carvers called practiciens who assisted and instructed the carving. Everything was paid for, every last model and every meal. However, the students were expected to give something in return for this ideal situation. Each year, students had to send back to Paris various works. These works were known as envoys, and these essentially served 2 purposes. One, these works of art were often bought by the French state, so it was like a little return of investment in these students. Secondly, the envoys were a proof of a student's progress in gleaning from Rome all that a student might, demonstrating fluency in the language of the classical world. Unlike the competitions at the École des Beaux-Arts, the subject of these envoys were up to the students, although they did have to be approved by the director of the Academy of France. But the form in which these envoys had to take was explicit. For the first year, the envoy had to be a marble copy of an antique statue. For the second year, the students had to send back a life-sized bas-relief of a single or 2-figure composition. Third year was to be both a life-size figure in the round and a multi-figure relief. The fourth year, another life-size figure in the round, and a composition sketch of a figure group up to 3 figures. The fifth and final year, the students were expected to enlarge their sketch from the previous year into a large figure group. And we'll hear how the fiercely independent Carpeaux dealt with the structure and the requirements of his stay in Rome when the Sculptor's Funeral continues. Hey, podcast listeners. Just a quick shout out for my new sponsor. In case you haven't heard the good news, the Sculptor's Funeral is now brought to you in part by Blick Art Supplies, the oldest and largest supplier of professional art supplies in America. Everything a sculptor needs, from your favorite clay modeling tools, modeling stands, armature supplies, clays, plasters, molding and casting supplies. They have it all, and the shipping in the U.S. is free on most items if the order is over $100. And best of all, Ordering your supplies from Blick Art Supplies directly supports the Sculptors Funeral podcast. Just go to the podcast website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, click on any of the Blick buttons you find on the homepage or on the episode pages, and shop away. A percentage of your purchase goes to support the show, and it's very much appreciated. So the next time you need art supplies, click on Blick. And thanks. So despite these fairly clear-cut expectations and the ideal setting in which to achieve them, Carpeau's stay in Rome was turbulent. He apparently acquired some sort of medical condition with his eyes, which delayed the completion of his first envoy, and it seems to have plagued him for about the first 2 years of his stay. But beyond that, Carpeaux had a really bad attitude towards everything about the Academy of France. Here's a passage from a letter home to his parents after about 2 years at the Academy. Here my affairs aren't brilliant. The stipend is a ridiculous amount. My protests have been useless, and since my complaints, I get on very badly with the director. And finally, Italy pleases me not at all. We're barracked like privates. We're forced to come in at a set hour for lunch and dinner. In short, the liberty which makes a man is taken away. My studies have not done me any good since I've only looked. My illnesses have kept me from producing anything. In sum, here are 2.5 years lost. And as for the director of the Academy of France in Rome, Victor Schnetz, he himself records in a letter, "You were certainly right in telling me that Monsieur Carpeaux would bring me more trouble than pleasure. Since he's been at Rome, he's been able to do nothing in the usual manner." I should point out that the director of the Academy of France, Victor Schnetz, he was regarded as a pretty fair-handed guy, and in reading a lot of the letters which deal with Carpeaux, you get the sense that while he wasn't happy with Carpeaux, he was never unfair, and he gave Carpeaux a lot of slack, and even praised and encouraged him when Carpeaux merited it. But the director's job was to keep order at the Academy of France, and Carpeaux was just a natural-born rule-breaker. Now, despite Carpeau's own assertions, he was learning a lot, even if his education wasn't taking place when and where it should, according to the Academy of France. In various letters to family and friends, Carpeaux records what he has really occupied himself with in the first years of his Roman stay. Quote, "Here I'm learning architecture because the antique monuments are so admirable. I'm also cultivating painting along with sculpture. These 3 arts are related, and I want to know them. My taste has been raised and strengthened by the sight of these masterpieces. I am often told I have a head like Michelangelo, that fertile genius of the Renaissance, whose works astound everyone who cultivates any one of the 3 arts he practiced so nobly. In fact, I feel a vivid sympathy in my imagination for that great man, and all my works are marked by his gigantic stamp." And in another letter, he writes, "For 2 years I've lived in Rome's streets, looking at nature for the distraction I cannot find in the studio. It's there that I've quarried my most extensive series of observations. I've done drawings based on movements, and I've achieved a certain merit in this genre, which distinguishes me, it is said, from others. I'm even told that no one draws like me at the Academy." So here we find Carpeaux practicing a brand of self-education that would have made his childhood instructor, Joseph Jacoto, proud. Likewise, Carpeau's study of nature on the move and in the streets would have been very much to the liking and tastes of Francois Rude. We can easily see that, regardless of the requirement now and then to toe the party line when it comes to the academic style, Carpeaux takes every opportunity to pursue his interest and his education in the way he sees fit. In doing so, he shows an independence that was characteristic of Romantic artists of the time. We see the first fruits of these independent impulses in Carpeau's third-year envoy, which was required to be a life-size figure in the round. This sculpture is known as Young Fisher Boy with a Seashell, and could be the best friend and playmate of Francois Rude's Neapolitan Fisher Boy playing with a tortoise, made by Rude 20 years earlier. Carpeau's work depicts a crouching youth, nude except for the same familiar knit cap that Francois Rude used to indicate that the child is a Neapolitan fisher boy. Carpeau's figure is holding a seashell up to his ear, and he sports a large, cheeky grin. The work really is both a companion piece for Rude's Fisher Boy, but also an evolution from it. When Rude made his Fisher Boy in 1831, he had to be very careful to adhere to the neoclassical dictates which require a stillness, grace, and tranquil beauty meant to hearken back to Greek ideals. But there is nothing of the expected Greek influence in Carpeaux's Fisher Boy. Instead, we see Carpeaux's studies of people in the Roman streets and his efforts to capture them in motion start to pay off. The child is crouching, but it's an active, momentary pose, with a twist in the torso that suggests he's about to spring to his feet. And then there's the smile, a large, open-mouthed, toothy grin that has almost no precedent in sculpture except for the stunningly charming portrait bust Jean-Antoine Houdon made of his own wife in the 1780s. In later years, many of Carpeaux's figures would carry this joyful, naturalistic grin and become almost an emblem of not only Carpeaux's work, but of the exuberance of the Second Empire of France in which Carpeaux lived and worked. It's tempting to attribute Carpeaux's choice of subject for his first major work as an explicit declaration of choosing sides, allying himself with naturalism, Francois Rude, and the Romantics, and against the academic style and the strictures of the École des Beaux-Arts and the Academy of France. But it's a much more calculating and less idealistic choice than that. For one thing, Francois Rude's Fisher Boy made a big impact when it was unveiled, but that was in 1831. Carpeaux's Fisher Boy hits the scene in 1858. Now, in the intervening 27 years, the subject of Neapolitan, kids playing around with things had been addressed again and again by many sculptors in many variations. By Carpeaux's time, it was a respectable genre subject and would not raise eyebrows by its subject matter alone. Even Carpeaux's academic instructor, Francisque Duret, had submitted a dancing Fisher Boy to the same 1831 salon that Rude's Fisher Boy was first seen. So Carpeaux's work can actually be seen as an homage to both of his instructors, as polar as their methods and aesthetics may have been. And finally, Carpeaux, always with an eye toward the art market, he knew that he could achieve a level of success in selling reductions and copies of this work in multiple editions. He even made a charming female companion piece for his Fisher Boy years later and sold the pair as a matched set. The Fisher Boy with a seashell was every bit the success that Carpeaux knew it would be. Even with the by now familiar theme, his was lively and original compared to other sculptors' attempts at the subject, and the French government commissioned a marble version, which was shown at the Salon a few years later. Now, in the summer of 1858, the year he sent the Fisher Boy to Paris, Carpeaux traveled from Rome to Florence, and he spent a month or so exploring the masterpiece of the Florentine Renaissance and deepening his attraction to and his understanding of Michelangelo. As you might guess, Michelangelo was not very high up on the Academy of France's list of sculptors which the students were meant to emulate. Michelangelo was too violent and grotesque and original. He was to be studied, maybe in a historical context, and perhaps even admired, but certainly not emulated, according to the dictates of the academic style. But Carpeaux felt that he had found a kindred spirit in Michelangelo, and that the Renaissance master had truly understood what was to be gained from the antique. In Carpeaux's own words, "Antique execution, that is slavery, and my spirit refuses this heritage. But in the epoch of the Renaissance, fearless geniuses broke the bonds of slavery. Under their chisels, marble and bronze began to palpitate with movement and with passion, without having lost anything of antique science. They understood how to introduce new elements into art. Their works were epoch-making, and still today, when an artist feels himself pale and cold, quick he runs to Michelangelo's works to warm himself in the rays of the sun." Well, when Carpeaux ran to Michelangelo and to Florence in the summer of 1858, he found there the beginnings of a solution to a sculpture that he had been contemplating for almost a year. At first, Carpeau's composition for this idea took the form of a relief, but the ideas for this work grew into a sculpture group in the round. Carpeaux had altered the composition time and again, taking inspiration from Michelangelo's fresco of the Last Judgment and from the Sistine frescoes, from the tomb of Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence, and even from a Florentine fountain sculpture by John Bologna. Finally, after his trip to Florence, Carpeaux was able to recount in a letter to a friend, quote, "I've just found my composition for the final year. It's a group of 4 figures. The praise I've received for this composition is a proof that I need only continue in the same direction. The subject is extremely dramatic. There is a great analogy to the Laocoon." Now, this figure group that Carpeaux imagined as being worthy of comparison to the antique masterpiece Laocoon gets its subject from the 33rd canto of Dante's Inferno. This passage records Dante meeting one of the damned souls in hell, a Count Ugolino, a traitor who was condemned to death. The Count was locked into a tower with his 4 sons and left to starve. The 33rd canto of Dante's Inferno contains the following. "When a small ray of sunlight found its way into that grim prison, and I saw on 4 faces the look that was on my own, I bit into both my hands for grief. And they, thinking I did it because I wanted to eat, without any hesitation rose and said, 'Father, it would hurt us far less if you ate us. It was you who made us put on this miserable flesh. Now you can strip it off.' I calmed myself, not to make them more unhappy. That day and the next we all stayed silent. Alas, hard earth, why did you not open? When we had arrived on the 4th day, Gaddo threw himself full length at my feet, saying, 'My father, why do you not help us?' Then he died. And, as you see me now, I saw the 3 of them fall one by one between the 5th day and the 6th. Then I started, already blind, to grope over their bodies, calling them for 2 days after they were dead. And after that, grief was less strong than hunger." Well, I have pictures of Carpeau's masterpiece, which is entitled Ugolino and His Sons, on the image gallery of the website. So go and check it out if you haven't seen it before, so you can see and understand how Carpeaux renders this gruesome scene of starvation and cannibalism. Carpeau's rendering depicts the Count Ugolino biting at his hands, while the oldest of his sons implores Ugolino to devour his own flesh. The other sons are in various states of decline, the youngest son either unconscious or dead, lying at the feet of Ugolino. Carpeau's Ugolino is a tremendously powerful work, and tremendously beautiful, with a composition and rendering that make it one of the most perfect sculptures ever executed. It is indeed a fully worthy companion to the Laocoon in expression and rendering and composition. The phenomenally naturalistic rendering of Ugolino's sons stands in contrast to the ghoulish, muscle-bound exaggeration of their father. It's as though we're not seeing Ugolino, the man himself, but the tormented damnation of his soul. In this work, we also see the benefit of Carpeau's unique education. 6 years learning François Rude's visual and scientific approach, and 4 years of Francisque Duré's anatomy and idealizing. These 2 modes of conceiving sculpture are fully united in Ugolino and His Sons. The brilliance of the Ugolino was as undeniable in 1862, when the final plaster was finished, as it is today. It catapulted Carpeaux into fame. The French government not only paid very well for its execution in marble, but had another one made in bronze to place in the Tuileries as a pendant sculpture to none other than a bronze cast of the Laocoon. But the quality of this masterpiece and the public reception it received belies the difficulty Carpeaux had in being allowed to create it. Carpeaux was still under the strictures of the Academy of France, which officially forbade many fundamental elements of this sculpture which make it so remarkable. The very source for the subject, Dante, that was off limits to pensionnaires of the Academy. Dante wasn't classical, he wasn't historical, he wasn't biblical, so it was not regarded as sufficiently academic. Further, the fifth-year envoy was meant to be no more than a 3-figure group, and Carpeaux's group contains 5. Such ambition simply was not allowed. But Carpeaux's ambition was not to be denied either. At the beginning stages of the clay model, when Carpeaux was counseled by the director of the Academy to choose another theme, Carpeaux tried to adapt the composition to a biblical theme, but ultimately became obsessed with this theme from Dante. The director of the Academy, Victor Schnetz, writes, "The other day he told me he is haunted by the idea of his group, has been unable to think of anything else, and has returned to it despite himself. This disobedience to the rules sets a bad example, and that was the reason I persisted in telling him to give in. But with a debtor, you take what you can get. So I'm letting him proceed at his own risk. He will have to make almost a masterpiece to win amnesty. I hope for his sake and ours it's not a fiasco." In due time, the director of the Academy recognized the masterpiece for what it was, and fought in Carpeaux's corner against the concerns of the Academy back in Paris. And even in the face of this remarkable work, the Academy, in its official report and judgment of Carpeaux's fifth-year envoy, could not entirely praise it, but felt the need to give a laundry list of all the ways that the Ugolino did not meet their academic expectations. For instance, they said that the figure of Ugolino did not communicate proper paternal sentiment for his sons, as though they're almost refusing to believe that the subject of the work was the horrors of starvation and cannibalism rather than the nobility of family loyalty. There was just no place for that theme in the academic style. They found the nudity of the group to be historically inaccurate and other such irrelevant nonsense. But at the end of the day, what the Academy and what some other critics really had a problem with was the failure of their own worldview of art. Right? The stewards of the academic worldview were, perhaps for the first time, forced to acknowledge achievement and greatness in sculpture that existed wholly outside their conception of what great art must be. Although it would be a few decades before open rebellion of artists against the Academy was commonplace, taking various forms such as the Salon des Refusés and the Impressionist movement, the remarkable achievement of the Ugolino and the ascendancy of Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux was a harbinger of the change to come. Well, I want to thank you all for listening. We'll hear more about the career of Carpeaux in an upcoming episode. As with all the great sculptors, there's always so much to talk about. I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and if you did, don't forget to give the podcast a rating or even a quick review on the iTunes page. You can also subscribe to the podcast for free on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever app you use to listen to podcasts. For a complete archive of the show, where you can listen for free to every episode, go to thesculptorsfuneral.com, where you can also click the donate button and help support this podcast, which comes to you entirely free of charge. You might also want to click on any of the banner links, which take you to Blick Art Supplies, the sponsor of the podcast. Buy some art supplies and support the podcast by doing so. And as always, you can join the conversation at the Facebook group page for the Sculptors Funeral. You can ask me a question, offer your opinion and insight, and hear what other sculptors and sculpture students around the world have to say. Thanks again, and I hope you have a productive week.